Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Colleen Roth. I'm with the River Heights Chamber of Commerce. This webinar is part of the Real-Time Solutions series brought to you by the Apple Valley, Burnsville, Hastings, Lakeville, and River Heights Chambers of Commerce. The goal of these webinars is to address business concerns and questions as we continue to navigate through this pandemic. A special thank you to our series sponsor, Dakota Electric. Dakota Electric has been a strong advocate for our business and chamber communities for many years. We thank them for their continued support. Some housekeeping items for this morning before we begin. All participants are muted, so if you do have a question, please type it in the chat or the Q&A feature, and we will try to get to them at the end if time allows. In addition, this webinar was also being recorded and will be made available on our partner websites. Today, we will be discussing developing a crisis-ready culture. We are thrilled to welcome Angie Aram of Goff Public. Ashley is a member of their media training and crisis communications team. In her time at Goff Public, Ashley has led nonprofit organizations through important transitions. She's helped clients build advocacy campaigns for critical issues at the state capitol and raise the profile of many organizations through smart media relations and digital communication strategies. Prior to Goff Public, Ashley spent years in the office of former St. Paul Mayor Chris Coleman, serving as press secretary and then as senior communications advisor. She started her career in corporate communications at Land O'Lakes, supporting leadership and business across the organization in public relations and social media. Ashley, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. We're very excited about what you have to share. And of course, very timely conversation we're having today.
Absolutely.
I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me this morning. And I know we don't have a ton of time, so good thing I'm a fast talker. I'll share as much as I can so we can leave time for questions. As Colleen said, my name is Ashley. I'm a senior account manager at Goff Public. We are an independent communications agency based in downtown St. Paul. We offer government relations and public relations services, from lobbying at the state capitol to media relations, strategy, and crisis communications. We work with a variety of clients, from large corporations, public entities, and local governments to small businesses and nonprofits, and have had increasing conversations around crisis at all levels in the last several months with our clients. So timely conversation for us to talk about building a crisis-ready culture today. So before we can really dive into best practices around crisis communications, it's important to note the unique environment we're operating in and how we got to this point. I know a lot of this might feel kind of obvious, but much of this has stemmed from the fact that we're now reachable 24/7. We can access information 24/7. And with this, we've lost our attention to detail. Our attention spans are shortening more and more every day, and we are a nation of headline readers, which can inflame our feelings on an issue without having all the information. The way we used to consume news and the way news used to be produced versus today, going from daily newspapers and morning and evening TV news to constant 24/7 reporting, has meant that everyone is a journalist, particularly with the rise of social media. We're seeing this with stories that have broken purely because somebody was there with a camera to capture it. With the rise of access to audiences via social media also came the rise in content. The ability to put information out on the same playing field as news outlets has meant the rise in alternative news sources and seeking information via social media. And we're, of course, seeing that much more during the pandemic as folks are home and on their phones a lot more frequently. We have seen how quickly information spreads because of social media and the opposition that can grow with it. And usually that's without the full context of the situation. Some call this cancel culture, where people are condemned for actions from the past, or more likely something they posted on social media. And that causes the call for a widespread cancellation of their product, their company, or content by the masses. All these things together have caused us to be more divided and distrusting of each other. We are seeing it with the current pandemic and through recent elections more acutely, but the distrust of institutions, businesses, governments has been slowly and steadily growing for years. What isn't new in all of this is the fact that emotions always trump logic, and that we as human beings tend to double down in our emotional convictions when presented with facts that might tell us otherwise. Pairing this with the increase in social media use, alternative news sources, and a cancel culture mentality has made for a very tenuous environment for anyone to be communicating in, businesses in particular. It also means that the likelihood of a crisis, reputational or otherwise, is at an all-time high, and so are the stakes. So the best way for an organization to prepare itself to both prevent and respond to crises is to build a crisis-ready culture. And kind of before we dive into that, I think we all kind of can come up with ideas in our minds of what constitutes a crisis. This is not an exhaustive list. Certainly what we're living through right now with the pandemic in and of itself is a crisis. Some are self-inflicted, like a misguided social media post. Others are out of your control, like an ongoing pandemic. What we know is that a poorly managed crisis can have a lot of bad effects. So it can damage your reputation, can result in significant financial costs, and probably most importantly, erode trust with your key audiences, which can ultimately affect your bottom line. That being said, organizations are measured more on how they respond to a crisis than the crisis itself, more often than not, which means that crises can create opportunities when responded to well. You've probably heard a lot about people having crisis communications plans, and those are super important and integral to responding in a crisis, but they're difficult to enact if you aren't operating in a crisis-ready culture. A crisis-ready culture is one where information, new ideas, and potential issues are freely discussed and shared at all levels. Employees have a strong understanding of the company's values and can communicate them clearly, and your external audiences understand your values as well. And a lot of this takes more than a one-time plan. So at Goff Public, we encourage organizations of all sizes to consider 5 steps to ensuring a crisis-ready culture. The first step is to really evaluate your crisis readiness, and so much of this begins with relationships. When thinking of your key audiences, you never want the first time that they hear from you to be during a crisis. So it's important to ask yourself, what relationships do you have that would be beneficial in a crisis? Which ones do you need? And do you know who to call in the event of a crisis? So this could be around local elected officials, public safety officials, regulators, community groups, even your employees or any vendors, customers, all of those people. It's also important to think through kind of the logistics and crisis response framework that you may or may not have at this point. Do you have an operational crisis plan? Do you have a crisis communications plan? Do you have folks who are identified as spokespeople at your company that can be quickly put out front if need be during a crisis? Current narratives and existing communications are important as well. What are your company's values, and are they clearly defined both with your internal and external audiences? Do you kind of know the negative and positive narratives about your company, and do you regularly share positive news stories or on any platform about your organization? And then finally, there are some high risk factors that just inherently make your organization more likely to be at risk of having a crisis, which could be just, the likelihood of safety accidents within your organization, likelihood of environmental risks. It could be rapid growth. It could be lack of relationships or lack of those community engagement or reputation opportunities. Step 2 is to create a crisis communications plan, and these plans need to be actionable and accessible. So, plans vary in size and detail depending on the needs of an organization. This doesn't have to be a super large or detailed plan, but having all of the information and steps in one place for your organization to be able to pick it up and execute it is a huge benefit. And I mentioned an operational plan previously, not the same thing as a crisis communications plan, but they should complement each other. So understanding what you are going to do operationally in a crisis, and then how you're going to communicate about that crisis to your key audiences is super important. And your plan should have an identified crisis communications team. So that's folks within your organization that would all come together in the event of a crisis to determine next steps and strategy moving forward. Step 3 is to practice. So training is important in making sure your crisis communications team understands the plan, understands how to execute it, and that those who you've identified as potential spokespeople have also been trained is super important. You know, companies that talk through scenarios that could happen at your organization and think through the worst case scenario are more likely to respond well in a crisis. So sitting down with your crisis communications team and walking through a real life scenario can be really helpful to make sure you know how to pick up that plan and use it when the time comes. Step 4 is building trust. This is more about that preventative piece, or making sure that you have a really strong foundation in the event that you do experience a crisis. Consistent, proactive communications with your key audiences and stakeholders that tell the story of your organization, reflect your values, and build trust is the foundation of a strong crisis-ready culture and will benefit you greatly in the event of a crisis. Also, those relationships we talked about, that if you do not have some of those relationships we talked about, work on building those. We are in the middle of a pandemic, so this is a little more difficult, but inviting elected officials to tour your business, participating in public safety drills and trainings, or reaching out and sharing operational plans with your public safety officials, connecting with neighborhood groups, and looking for opportunities to introduce yourself or engage them in what's happening at your organization are all super helpful in building trust within your community. And being an active member of your community is key as well. You know, philanthropy is great. It doesn't always have to look like giving money. It can be volunteering at local community cleanup events, anything that might be a way to connect with the people that are in the community around your business. And, you know, it's also important that while you're building trust externally, that you're doing the same with your employees. So, you know, the folks on the front lines of your organization are able to see and flag when a potential issue could become a crisis. So making sure that they kind of know the process for how to flag those things and make sure they feel comfortable that sharing that information so you can take steps to mitigate it going forward is super important. And then step 5, plan for regular maintenance. Crisis prevention and readiness is a year-round activity. So making sure that you're training in new spokespeople as staffing changes occur, or new folks on your crisis communications team, and reviewing and updating your plan annually is super important. And debriefing after a crisis to see what went well, what could have gone better, and what you might be able to change for next time will only make you and your organization more prepared. So we can't prevent every crisis, as we know, and many of them are totally outside of our control. So here are a few tips for responding when an issue does arise. For starters, establishing your organization as the source for all information is very important. You may not have much to say at the outset of a crisis, but identifying the issue and telling people where they can get more information can hold folks over until you do have more information. This helps establish your organization as the source of information and helps avoid speculation. It's also important to be thinking about who needs to hear from you. Who are your key audiences? How quickly can you reach them? Who has access to them, and in what order should they be communicated with? A lot of times your employees need to hear from you first, but assume that even if you're communicating to internal audiences, that communication could and will become public. So be comfortable with whatever you're putting in that internal communication being shared broadly. Proper tone is also super important. People expect organizations to sound like people, not institutions. So making sure that you're being empathetic and not sounding too robotic or factual. Avoid the throwaway phrases we hear every day. We take this very seriously. Our thoughts and prayers are with so-and-so, or we are committed to. It's hard not to use these phrases. There's a reason we use them frequently, but they have been used so much that they don't have much meaning anymore to folks. I would say the only one on this list that maybe you could get away with is we are committed to but only if you're following it up with specific actions or steps to kind of prove that commitment that you are referencing. Also, think about who your messages come from. It may not always be the top person at your organization. You may be giving a crisis more weight than it deserves if you put your CEO or your owner out in front of it. So thinking about who makes the most sense to carry the message is also important when thinking about tone. Your messages should be thoughtful and reflect your organization's values. We know that emotion trumps logic, so making sure that you acknowledge the feelings and emotions of a situation before trying to impart any new facts or information will just allow people to absorb information more readily. So listening and validating those emotions that people are feeling will just make people feel heard and more likely to take in what you're saying. So an example of this, we love to provide examples, and I know we don't have a ton of time, so I just put one in here, but a good example of an effective response during a crisis was a somewhat recent event that happened to US Bank. A customer in Portland, Oregon was having issues with holds that were being put on his paychecks, and he had been working with the bank to figure it out. But on Christmas Eve, he was trying to get gas and found his money hadn't been deposited. So he called the bank helpline, and a senior officer at their call center answered. And she spent an hour trying to help him get his money released so he could fill his tank and go home. But she felt bad for him and couldn't get it to work. So she drove to the gas station and personally handed him $20. Turns out that is against the rules and policies for the call center for employees to go meet customers. So she ended up being fired. The story ended up getting picked up by the New York Times. And from there, it ballooned into a massive news story. The company's initial statement stood by their decision, but when things blew up, the CEO was fully briefed and he issued an apology that was extremely well done from a crisis perspective. So here's his apology, and I won't read it out loud to you, but there are a few things that we can note that were done well. He acknowledges the organization's values and the emotion behind the situation right off the bat. In that second sentence, he takes full responsibility. And then in that last sentence, he does use the phrase about commitment, but he gives some specifics about what they're planning to do to fix the issue. A great apology and a great response in a crisis from a leader. Okay, I went through that pretty quickly, but I wanted to leave enough time for questions. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to fire away.
Thank you, Ashley. Wow, that was a ton of information.
I know.
I was like furiously writing. So as you were going through, because I have some questions that I know have been brought to my attention through some of our business and chamber members. So the very beginning, I think you said something super critically important to what's happening now. You talked about how we are a nation of headline readers. Mm-hmm. And it's true. People will read a headline and take an emotional response to that. How do you coach your clients into presenting, that information that is going to be used as a headline? What are some key points, or what are the highlights? Can you give away the trade secrets? Can you share them with us?
I think I'm understanding correctly in terms of how to kind of get your message out there and make sure it gets in the headline proactively, right?
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Yeah, having effective proactive messages means really being succinct and having only 3 top line messages anytime you are putting something out on your own channels, in a media interview, what have you. You want folks to really understand the point that you're trying to get across. If you share too much information, it gets lost, especially in a media interview. So going in and knowing what are the 3 key things you want your audiences to know and hitting those over and over again is super important. And having calls to action can be really helpful with that as well. If there's something that you want your audience to do, make sure that that's getting through. And I could go into the entirety of our spokesperson training, but there's lots of tips in that space. But yeah, it's really important that you have a lot of message discipline when you're putting out your proactive messages, and be thinking about what you want that headline of a story to be.
Oh, thank you.
Mhm.
I think super important information. Another thing that you talked about is social media, and we all know how powerful it is. And the blending of social media and emotions, people have the tendency to react emotionally to social media posts. So let's say, for an example, we have a business that's, I'm hesitant to use the word pivot because I think that's being overused right now, but a restaurant or a business that has to pivot operations to try to just stay afloat during the pandemic. And there's some missteps along the way and they get a bad review on social media. What is your advice for responding to those sorts of things?
Sure. If somebody had a bad experience or they're asking a genuine question, it's always good to respond. And when you think about your response, of course, you want to be thoughtful of what that person experienced, but you also want to think about the rest of your audience that's seeing what's going on your channel. The best thing you can do is acknowledge that person's emotions and try your best to take that conversation off of social media. Encourage them to reach out to your customer service line, ask them for their contact information so you can contact them directly. Usually you can say, if you can direct message us your information, we'd love to reach out and see what we can do to remedy the situation. Whatever you can do to kind of take that conversation off social media, but acknowledge it and show your audiences that you care and you're hearing what that person has to say is a good way to keep this conversation from becoming bigger than it has to be, but also still acknowledging your customer's question or their issue.
Thank you, Ashley. We've had a couple of people that are interested in hearing how the US Bank story ended. Do you know if that call center rep got his job back, or how did that story end?
This is such a good question, and I actually was trying to look into it last night as well, because we've used this example. I believe this happened around Christmas time last year, and the last that I saw, she was still not working at the company. But if I find out, I will absolutely let everyone know.
That's great. People always like to hear that. And
Yeah.
Someone had asked if she filed a counter lawsuit or anything for wrongful termination rights or along those lines.
That's a really good question too. And I have absolutely no idea, but again, now you're making me want to go do some digging after.
And I work kind of sneaking up here on the end of our time together. Just another quick question.
Mm-hmm.
One of the slides you were talking that was titled like proper tone and alternate ways of saying things. And we take this seriously. We're committed to this, our thoughts and prayers. I'm guilty myself of writing thoughts and prayers. And it's unfortunate that we have so many situations where we need to use these phrases. But what are your recommendations for other ways of saying those, of getting those sentiments across?
There are so many ways, and they always escape us when the situation comes. But if you take a look at the very specific situation itself and try to get personal about it, a good example that we use is when the helicopter crashed that had National Guard members on it and they died. This was, I think, last year here in Minnesota. Multiple elected officials put out really wonderful statements in response to what happened, and all of them took it from a different kind of personal perspective. So Governor Walz, as someone who had served in the National Guard, kind of referenced that angle from a personal perspective. I believe Majority Leader Gazelka put out something that was also very much about being grateful for the service that these folks provided to our state and to our country. So trying to take a more personal, look at where you can make those connections and try to acknowledge those, as opposed to going straight to kind of our typical places like thoughts and prayers.
Oh, thank you. We got another question about, I'm trying to find it here, using video messages. Should a video message be included in communications, crisis communications, any type of, talk about using a video communication.
Sure. Every crisis is going to take a different response. And so it all depends on what's going on. And I would say that now more than ever, with the inability to be as in person as we used to be, that might be a great opportunity if it's maybe sharing a video message with your employees who are scattered all over because you're not in an office together, or if you are trying to kind of showcase a specific thing using video. But typically, when we think about crisis, we don't want to over respond. So thinking about who needs to hear from you and when and how is always the best place to start. And it might be that you find that video would be best, and that could be a great tool for your organization to use. As long as you feel comfortable and know that wherever that video is put, that it would be likely to become public.
So that could potentially be one of the drawbacks of using a video, is that once it's out there like everything else, and it could become public if it's meant to be internal. So you would just advise people to think carefully about that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Oh, that's great. Well, I don't think we have any more questions. Thank you so much, Ashley, for joining us today. Just a reminder, this recording will be available on the Chamber Partners websites. We want to thank our sponsor, Dakota Electric. And this webinar is a part of the Real-Time Solutions series brought to you by the Apple Valley, Burnsville, Hastings, Lakeville, and River Heights Chambers of Commerce. If you want more information on a particular topic, please feel free to reach out to your local chamber and let us know. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you have a wonderful day. Ashley, thank you for your time this morning. And again, the recording will be available on Chamber websites. Tons of great information, and we appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.